Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Coffee and Tea with AARP, a biweekly conversation in which AARP staff and volunteers talk with Connecticut decision makers about policies and programs that are of interest to older residents. My name is John Erlingheuser, and I'm the Senior Director of Advocacy and Community Outreach at AARP in Connecticut. And I'm very pleased today to be joined by one of our great AARP Connecticut volunteers, Rik Caron. Hey, Rik, thanks for being with us this morning. And before we get started with our special guest, why don't you tell the folks a little bit about yourself, your background, and what you do for AARP?
Yes. Good morning, all. I live in Old Saybrook, and I've been volunteering for AARP for roughly 7 years and did some assist prior to that and get some great satisfaction from being involved with electric choice presentations, which still remains a very hot topic amongst the community around us here in Connecticut. I also have been involved with Fraud Watch Network, and I really get satisfaction from being up at the Legislative Office building when you're all in session to be a part of that as well.
Well, that's great, Rik. We couldn't do what we do at AARP if it weren't for the great army of volunteers that we have that care so much about fighting for our fellow members. So we really do appreciate that. And so it's also my great pleasure to welcome State Senator Norm Needleman of the 33rd District. He is co-chair of the legislature's Energy and Technology Committee, and Senator Needleman also serves on the Planning and Development, Commerce, Finance, Revenue and Bonding, and Transportation Committees, which is quite a heavy load for one senator. And so, Senator Needleman, can you tell us a little bit about your background outside of the legislature, what towns you represent, and anything you think that would be pertinent in that regard for our viewers?
Well, thank you, thank you both. And I live in a town next to Old Saybrook. Rik knows that. I am also the first selectman of Essex, and love both of the jobs that I do in public service. For me, at this point in my life, I'm certainly qualified to be an AARP member, but I feel like we all have to keep contributing and give back that which we've received. And I've had a very lucky life based on a lot of things that happened. My background, in a real nutshell, is I was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. I went to school there and ended up going to college at Adelphi University. And at the same time I was in college, I drove a taxi cab in New York for 4 years, which, apart from working for my father, was truly the school of hard knocks. And I ended up meeting somebody in my cab who offered me a job to work for a medical device company. I worked for him for 6.5, 7 years, started my own company to make a product for that company, and have been in business since 1979. I started serving the public in a broader way than a volunteer on a board or commission, running for elected office in 2003, and have been on the board of selectmen and first selectman since then, now in my 7th term as first selectman. I am in my 3rd term as state senator, and was given chairmanship of the Energy and Technology Committee, largely because I had a lot of issues with the way the utilities were responding to storms. And I didn't know the nuances of energy policy at that time, but I think I've become relatively knowledgeable about that, about trash, about septic, about things that were never my life's goals, but I do believe you go where the universe directs you, and it directed me to these things. And I think I'm a pretty balanced person when it comes to trying to solve the problems that we need to solve.
That's really interesting. I laughed when you talked about giving back in the service. My father worked in a factory, raised 6 kids, and retired. And that was when he decided to run for local city council and serve there until almost the end of his life. So that's a great thing. And people, we need to get back to that notion of giving back and providing what we can to help better our community. So we really do appreciate that in your service, Senator. And so with that, I'm going to kind of turn it over to Rik Caron, and he'll take it from here for a little bit.
Senator, AARP, as you well know, has been quite active and remains so on issues surrounding utilities. Can you tell us about your role as the co-chair of the Energy and Technology Committee a little bit, and what that role entails, and what state legislative proposals does your committee have jurisdiction over?
So, we set policy. We don't actually manage, the utilities in the sense of the way Pure does. We direct the agencies to do things, and I'd like to say that one of my goals as chair of the Energy Committee was to make sure that the utilities work more for our interests than for their own. And I think that we have passed some, bills that they don't like, but I think that we're long overdue. Since deregulation, this has become sort of an open field to make a lot of money, and I'm not in favor of people making a lot of money. I certainly am a capitalist, but I also think that the oversight over the public utilities, which are franchise licenses for monopolies in the state of Connecticut, were not overseen well. So 2 giant bills that we passed were Take Back Our Grid, and then last year Senate Bill 7, that certainly tightened the regulatory climate in the state of Connecticut. Sadly, the utilities are not seeing this in a positive light, and they're kicking and screaming all the way. We have a great partner in Pura, because they're, apart from using new tools, they're applying old tools in ways that had not been applied. And I think the ratepayers are going to see benefits out of that over the long term. That said, policies related to climate change mitigation and decarbonization of our electric grid have been critical to the work we've done. And we passed also some, landmark bills on the procurement of large amounts of wind energy, more solar energy. The decision that was reached prior to my getting elected to maintain Dominion's position in the state with regard to Millstone, I think have all been critical bills that we've done. The Dominion one happened before I got here, but I would have supported it had I been here. It was not a bipartisan bill. It was largely a Republican initiative, but it is a southeastern Connecticut issue with thousands and thousands of jobs. And it's, a fixed price for carbon-free energy that's baseload power that is really good for our state and the region.
Senator, that's amazing work you're doing on the Energy and Technology Committee. And you mentioned Take Back Our Grid, and there were really some great components of that piece of legislation that AARP supported and championed, some of them for years. So can you talk a little bit about why those are, what they are and why they're so beneficial to folks, and why they were part of that legislation?
Well, I think there's a recognition that rates are high, and they're high in the Northeast for a lot of reasons. As I have said many times, where we are on the pipeline, the fact that we live in a very wooded state and people love their trees. So we have a vulnerable grid. It costs a lot more money to maintain that. If everything was clear cut 100 feet on either side of the power lines, you would not have the level of problems that we have when there's a storm. But we felt that acknowledging that a movement to a more sustainable, clean, environmentally friendly electric grid was not going to be cheap. We wanted to make sure that the poorest people, the lowest income, seniors, and other people are not negatively impacted and cannot afford to pay their electric bill. So we did put in something that allows Pura to develop a program for hardship rates. And hardship rates, I think she's just released a draft of that docket. I think that's going to be very, very important for people. We also put in, there were so many sections of all of these bills, but we put in something called performance-based rate making, which basically says to the utilities, if you perform well, you make more money. If you perform poorly, you make less money. We're taking a leadership role in the country in doing that. And developing those standards has been complicated. The utilities, again, have pushed back at every turn because they're afraid that they're going to lose profit. And I want healthy, successful utilities in the state of Connecticut. But I also want to know that the ratepayers in the state, low, middle, upper income, business, private sector, individuals feel like they're getting the best value for their money. And I don't think that people have traditionally felt that. So those things were very critical parts of the bill.
Senator, and we really do appreciate that, the hardship issues, the low income discount rates, the reimbursement for food and spoiled food and medicine. I mean, that stuff was like, critical for our members. We heard the most on that. And, the fact that you were able to get those things in addition to, the performance of utilities through was quite an achievement. And I can, and we're seeing the results. As you mentioned earlier, you're not the regulatory body, you set policy, but we're starting to see the results of the work that the legislature has done in rate cases. And obviously you're going to hear utilities screaming about it, but we're getting, we think, ratepayers a fair shake and hopefully improving utilities. So we do appreciate that work. So Rik.
Yes, Senator, share with us some of the various ways that ratepayers can pursue on their own to contain the cost of the electric bills. I think many people would welcome that input from you.
Sure. Well, I think that we have a pretty robust, energized CT program. One is, and I say this with all due caution, for people who want to follow electric rates, which I don't, frankly, on my home bill, I participate in buying energy through the utility, Eversource in my case, and use the standard service. People can certainly shop energy, but they have to be very careful because we know, also one of the things that I'm proud of is we began to rein in some of the abuses in the third-party electric market, which I now am learning that are going on in the people who are selling solar to residential people. We're trying to rein these businesses in to not take advantage of customers, especially low income and elderly customers. Easy to sell people a bill of goods. And so let the buyer beware to some extent, but let us make sure that this industry is carefully monitored, solar and third party. But there are opportunities there. Also, all the energy efficiency programs are critical, depending on the house that you live in, whether, doing everything you can to insulate and whatever is affordable to you to make sure that you're not just wasting energy out the windows and doors in your house, weather stripping, replacing parts, which, there are subsidies for these things. That's when people look at their bill, they'll see a public policy section of their bill now. That public policy is the Clean Energy Fund. We put money aside. Every ratepayer pays into this fund, and every ratepayer has the opportunity to look at ways in which that fund could benefit them. And I think that's important. One of the biggest switches, which sort of happened over time, but was subsidized through the Clean Energy Fund, is the light bulb change. I like a bright light in my house. So a 100-watt incandescent bulb was, between 75 and 100 is what I had. Now a 75-watt incandescent bulb is replaced by a 7 or 8-watt LED. The same thing is true proportionally with a 100-watt bulb or a 40-watt bulb. So lighting alone has saved a lot of money, but there are other ways to do it in terms of weatherproofing your house as much as possible. So, and I'm switching to the most efficient heating and cooling system if you can afford it and when the time is right.
Well, thank you. That's very detailed recommendations for folks to incorporate and see how it fits for them in their own personal situations.
and Senator, we can't stress enough the fact that we've put in worked with you and others to put in such strong consumer protections in the third party market that we've taken a lot of the risk out of it. And so when standard service over the last year and a half, 2 years has skyrocketed, there are some good deals because there are no cancellation fees, there are no variable rates, and there are some really good strong protections that you still have to be cautious and monitor and do all those things, but at least we know people aren't going to get burned for the long haul and large sums of money. So we appreciate all that, and people could find out at energizect.com all about those energy efficiency programs and third-party electric suppliers, and we really do encourage folks to take a look at all of that. And I just would like to say again, Rik Caron is one of our great volunteers that actually helps people understand how to navigate that market and make what choice is best for them. So that's one of the great services our volunteers provide. So what are some of kind of the other priorities you have for this year? I know you're in the midst of having public hearings at the legislature, and we're into March already. So what are your priorities for the Energy Committee that you chair this year?
Well, I think because last year Senate Bill 7 had 28 parts, which really meant it was 28 separate bills rolled into one. It was my show, and my co-chair, was new as chair, although he'd been on the committee for a long time, also a strong ratepayer advocate. He did a great job in getting that bill through the House. I felt that this year, one, because I'm worn down, but more importantly, because he's had priorities in his tenure on the committee that now as chair, he's trying to figure out what are the right policies with regard to more solar, more renewables. And honestly, I think as a chair, I've been different than many chairs. You note that Senate Bill 7 and Take Back Our Grid passed unanimously through the Senate. That meant I was listening and working closely with the Republicans, which I think is critical. I try to keep the party politics at the door as much as possible and work collaboratively, originally with Senator Formica, who you guys know I had a long-term friendship with outside of the legislature. But also Senator Fazio has been really thoughtful and good to work with, and I appreciate that. So we're trying to work on bills that we can all support, is what it comes down to. But this year, Jonathan Steinberg is working a lot on solar. He's a strong proponent of solar.
Well, and I'm glad to see as well, when you said solar, you mentioned it earlier when we talked about ways people can contain their costs, that, you're going to look at, consumer protections. We had AARP, we had a lot of issues with the third party electric supplier market, but even not just the market, we had issues with the whole concept. But solar is a whole different animal. It's a good product. It's a needed product and service. And we want to make sure it's available and that people are getting, the fair and right information, because we do want to see, people take advantage of renewables and things like that. So we're glad that you're going to be looking at that as a committee in terms of how we could, work together to make sure that the industry is protected from itself in some instances when we talk about the bad actors. But I do want to just mention, you mentioned Senate Bill 7 and AARP. I want to say again, thank you to you for all your work on that. And we were very pleased to be able to recognize you this year as one of our legislative champions for all the work that you did on Senate Bill 7, which was really, as you pointed out, a companion to the Take Back Our Grid Act, and those things really are, great, and we're seeing the impact on those in so many ways, and regulation, and in new programs, and in staking our claim to the future in energy. So we do want to thank you for that, and we appreciate it, and you've done yeoman's work at the legislature in that regard, and we appreciate it.
Thank you. I just want to bring up one other thing, two other things, actually, just really quickly. If anybody feels that there's anything inappropriate happening with their electric bill, with the way they're being treated by their supplier, third-party supplier, utility, Pura has a hotline. They take calls all the time. You know, people will come to me with problems and I'll say, well, Pure's hotline, that's exactly what it's there for. So do not hesitate to reach over to the Public Utilities Regulatory Authority. They have customer service hotline. It's firewall. They actually try to resolve people's problems all the time. And the other thing I wanted to talk about, which seems to be a painful, agonizing issue that I hope AARP is advocating for in every way possible. And I'm not sure that there's an easy fix. Another area where seniors were particularly hurt financially was in long-term care insurance. And it is almost an intractable problem. It's a clear-cut case of an industry that oversold and underdelivered, overpromised and underdelivered. And what people who have been, you know, who bought policies when they were 50, hoping that they would have money at the end if they ever needed long-term care, the rates have gone through the roof. And these companies should not have been allowed to sell these products, but that ship has sort of sailed. I'm not sure what kind of relief there can be, but I get all kinds of emails from people saying we should do something about it. And I know you guys advocate regularly with insurance, and
Yes, yeah, no,
and
and
so do I.
we're very concerned with all the issues around long-term care insurance policies and you know, affordability, paying out what they're supposed to be paying out, people not knowing what the fine print of policies were after paying for years and years and years premium. So yeah, Senator, that's a really important issue, and we're going to be working on that. And you know, so I appreciate you highlighting that. And on that note, I you know, before Rik asks his last question, I'm going to ask you anything else, you know, because I'm glad you brought up non-energy issues. You know, you're on a million committees. I think you're probably on more than anybody in the legislature. And, you know,
No, I don't think so.
being first selectman, running a business and doing all those committees is amazing to me. But it just goes to your stamina. So why don't, you know, anything else other than utilities issues and the long-term care insurance issue that you want to quickly highlight before we get to our last question?
Well, I think that, you know, one of the areas that I focused a lot of energy on, I didn't get everything done that I thought I should have gotten done, is the issue of solid waste management. What do we do with our garbage? Where does our garbage go? It's costing us a lot more to get rid of it now. It's impacting every taxpayer in the state, whether they use private contractors or have municipal pickup. And I think that one of my goals is to work on a more comprehensive solid waste management strategy, because in the early 80s, Connecticut led you know, the country in how we dealt with solid waste. We shut all of our landfills. We had these burn plants that took all of our garbage. We were generally self-contained garbage generated in Connecticut, stayed in Connecticut. Where we are now is a lot of the garbage that's generated here ends up in landfills in adjacent states or even further away. And I don't think that's been the best approach. So I work a lot on that. And
you know, that's a big issue, Senator. I live in Derby, Connecticut, and we're a distressed municipality to begin with. And, you know, it's just been kind of discovered that they've under budgeted $1 million because of the increase in costs of waste disposal. We are a municipal, you know, they contract to pick up our trash in Derby. So it's just a huge issue. And I think there are tons of municipalities, and you representing one as a first selectman, know, that are kind of in the same boat. So that's you know, and it's a really critical issue, because why it impacts our bottom line on our already, you know, high property taxes. So it is a critical issue. And there's the environmental side of it as well. So that is a huge issue to tackle. And we appreciate you taking that on. So Rik, why don't you go for our final question?
Yes, as you well know, Senator, AARP volunteers have testified before the General Assembly in the past, going back in time. Can you suggest some of the ways that the public might stay informed about the work going on in the General Assembly, and some of the ways that they can participate more in the process, both during sessions and when you're not in session? We'd welcome your input on that, sir.
Well, I'm going to first of all speak for myself and say that I send out a weekly newsletter, And it is not an opinion-based newsletter. It's the facts, just the facts. And I want to encourage all my colleagues. I believe most of my colleagues in the Senate do exactly the same thing. Send out, continually communicate. That's our obligation to the constituents that we have, Democrats and Republicans, unaffiliated, it doesn't matter. Keep them informed. And I think that one of the collateral benefits, and I hate to ever think that there were collateral benefits of the pandemic because it seems to have faded in people's memories, but the ability to do things like we're doing right now, where we can testify and participate if there's an issue, where does my responsibility as a legislator to engage you or first selectman, which I can tell you it's very hard. Essex runs very smoothly, so we don't get a lot of engagement until they're not happy. When they're not happy, we get a lot of engagement right away. But where does our responsibility to, encourage engagement and where does the public's interest in being engaged begin? It's a very, there's a line there. And I believe that if you want democracy to work well, you have to participate. Democracy is not a spectator sport. So to whatever extent you have an interest, vacations are nice, sitting around the house watching The Big Bang Theory, which I'm a victim of, is wonderful. But the reality is, be active, be part of the process, be engaged. We've made it easier. We want to continue to make it easier. And I think every citizen in a democracy has a responsibility to do that. Because otherwise, you're just going and saying to someone else, you worry about it. And then I'll only complain when I don't like the outcome. If you're not part of it, then you're not part of it. So vote, make sure people are registered to vote your conscience, be engaged in what we do here, be engaged in your town where you can have the most impact. I think it's really important to remember that.
Absolutely. And I look forward to your very frequent communications coming to us in the mailbox and through the Shoreline paper and so forth. So keep that going, and hopefully your colleagues will take note of how effective it is in doing so.
And Senator, we do appreciate that, and we often say this. We do now, because of the pandemic. When you talk about the residual, pluses, right? I mean, was that we started a webinar series every Wednesday on different topics. Well, we found that there are people who want to continue doing it that way, so we're able to help people navigate fraud and so many different things because they want to do it virtually, and we still go out and do presentations. So now we kind of do it both ways, just like you do your public hearings. So we think that's great. So with that, I think we're going to come to a close for another edition of Coffee and Tea with AARP Connecticut. And I want to thank our special, very, very special guest, Senator Norm Needleman. Senator, you have anything you want to part with our folks before we leave?
No, just keep up the good work. Really, really appreciate everything you guys do.
Well, thank you so much, Senator. We appreciate your being a champion for ratepayers and others in Connecticut. And I also want to thank our great volunteer from Old Saybrook, Rik Caron, who's a representative of the many, many, many AARP volunteers that are out making sure that the interest of those 50 and older in Connecticut are protected. So that brings us to a close, and thank you all very much.